All right, this is our last set of notes for this unit. We're going to cover the structure and function of leaves, as well as just the very quick basics on the transport of materials throughout the plant. Okay, reminders, you picked up a handout when you came in. It's just one page, so fold it, and then this will go in your lecture notebook behind the notes from last week, which were roots and stems. Okay, and fill it in as you go. Remember that there are diagrams as well, so make sure that you don't overlook those and add the missing labels for them. Also, audio, again, make sure you have headphones on or subtitles if you prefer that way, but make sure that you're not only writing what's on the screen. You should jot down things that I'm taking time to explain. If I give like a couple of examples for certain things, like that's an indication you should definitely write those down. You're going to be responsible for that information too. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to just quickly go over the anatomy of a leaf to start things off. So remember that plants have a single layer of dermal tissue covering the outside. That single layer of epidermis cells. That's dermal tissue, okay? However, leaves also have a waxy cuticle outside of the epidermis. And it's this waxy layer that creates some waterproofing qualities, and we'll see why that's important later on in this set of notes. But the epidermis and the cuticle are both the outermost layers. And then there are a few other structures that you're seeing are labeled here. So the broad, flattened, very thin area of a leaf is known as the blade. Okay, so it's pointing to the green flattened main area where photosynthesis takes place. You can also see that there are a bunch of veins. Now, these veins all join at this kind of middle rib, I guess you could say. That's called a petiole. So inside of that, you would see both xylem and phloem, but then it branches out into thinner and thinner branches, and these are veins. They too have both xylem and phloem. And if we were to, kind of trace each of these and go down the petiole, you would connect to the stem, which would eventually connect down to the roots. So that's how the vascular system kind of pans out in a plant. Okay, so the main function of leaves is to absorb light and to be the site where photosynthesis takes place. So the place where the carrying out of photosynthesis happens. So as always in biology, the way that something is built has everything to do with its function. So same thing here. Leaves are designed to optimize these processes, absorption of light and carrying out photosynthesis. And we see that leaves are actually made up of there are a couple of important structures that tie very closely to this whole primary function. So one is that most of the leaf tissue is made up of mesophyll, and mesophyll is a type of ground tissue that is designed to optimally carry out photosynthesis. So has lots and lots of chloroplasts, and even in terms of its location, which we'll see in a second, it's all designed to allow for the most photosynthesis to happen. Okay, now there are different types of mesophyll cells. There are palisade ones, and these palisade mesophyll are more towards the upper surface of a leaf. We're going to see a diagram that has like a cross section of a leaf in a second here. But palisade mesophyll cells are the ones that are higher up, like towards the top surface of a leaf. And they are the main ones responsible for actually absorbing the light. So think of like little solar panels on the roof of a house, kind of the same idea. And then we have spongy mesophyll, and spongy mesophyll is usually just underneath the palisade mesophyll. And the way that spongy mesophyll is organized is it's a bit more of a looser type of tissue. There's lots of gaps and lots of spaces, air spaces, and they, because of the way that they're built, are really responsible for allowing gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen to move freely through that kind of bottom half of the leaf. Okay, so those are a couple of important structures that help with photosynthesis. They're not the only ones though. If we look on the next slide, there are also some specialty cells. Okay, so another type of important cell that you'd find on a leaf, specifically the underside of a leaf, are stomatas. Stomatas are actually the pores, little holes like the one that you see here, kind of like the hole in this donut shape. They're little pores on the underside of the leaf. And then what surrounds a stomata is I guess we could say, quote unquote, the little donut that we see here. These are guard cells. There's actually one here, and then there's one here. There are two of them, like a pair. Okay, and these two surround the stomata, and both of these, the stomata, which is the hole itself in the middle, and the guard cells on the outside, they work together to help with gas exchange with the outer environment. So allowing carbon dioxide in and allowing oxygen out. So we'll talk about that in a second here. Okay. So the spongy mesophyll, that lower mesophyll layer, because that's the site where gas exchange happens most commonly. The surface area of the spongy mesophyll is actually kept wet a lot. So there's a lot of moisture in that area so that gases can pass through the walls of those cells quite easily. Um, and so what ends up happening with spongy mesophyll is because they are always kept wet, there's the risk that the plant can lose a lot of moisture through the spongy mesophyll. And so there's this process called transpiration that's very common that can happen. Transpiration is a loss of water through that a plant undergoes through its leaves. Okay, so as photosynthesis is happening and it's um, certain tissues on the undersides of these leaves, the mesophyll, sorry, spongy mesophyll, when it gets exposed to air, it will, that evaporation process happens naturally. And so what ends up happening is this water just gets lost to the atmosphere. Like you can see these arrows coming out. Now, whenever that water leaves the plant, it has to be replaced because remember that spongy mesophyll has to keep wet in order for photosynthesis to happen. So what actually ends up happening is transpiration drives more water to get pulled from the roots up the stem to the leaves to replace that water that's lost through evaporation. So transpiration actually drives the movement of water upwards and kind of pulling that water from the roots and from the soil. Okay, so when I say gas exchange, what I mean specifically is um, if we think back to the equation for photosynthesis, there are a couple of gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, that are really important. Carbon dioxide is the gas that is a reactant, it's needed for photosynthesis to take place. Mainly because that's what's going to supply the carbon that will be put into glucose, the final product. Oxygen is a byproduct. So after photosynthesis takes place, oxygen is one of the resulting substances, one of the resulting elements that comes out of it and needs to be released back into the environment. Okay, now fortunately, and that's fortunate for us because we need oxygen to breathe. So that's that's how plants provide for us. um, but this gas exchange takes place at the stomata, like I said. Okay, so these pores, here's a stoma. Stomata is plural, by the way, stoma is singular. So this gas exchange um, is important to happen through these pores. These pores will open up to allow carbon dioxide in and will at the same time also allow oxygen out. Now, the only problem is if these, you'd think that since carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis, that it kind of makes, maybe these stomata should stay open all the time. Well, that's actually not good also, because remember, um, these, the moisture inside of the leaves, if these were left open, would actually evaporate too quickly and the plant could dry out. So these stomata are not open all the time. In fact, we're going to look in later on in this week, we're going to do a bit of a look into kind of when they tend to open and when they tend to close. But the whole point is stomata tend to be open just enough to allow photosynthesis to take place, so to be able to let in enough carbon dioxide, but not so much that the plant ends up losing too much moisture, too much water. And so the way that these stomata kind of do that is they have this ability to open and shut. Okay, so they don't stay open, and the opening and closing of the stomata is a result of these guard cells. Remember these cells that form the outside kind of um, entryway into the stoma. Okay, so um, these cells actually water pressure kind of holds them open. So in order for a stoma to stay open, these guard cells actually their water pressure, a lot of water is taken into them. They get really swollen, and as a result they kind of bulge and pop open, like kind of have this curve to them, and then that's what allows this opening now that can allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to go through. Whenever they need to close, what happens is the plant will control how much water is in these, and they kind of shrink down, and then they end up snapping shut like you see here. Okay, so there are different times of the day where these will stay open and when they'll be closed. Okay, generally speaking, stomata usually open during the daytime, which makes sense. They need to be open to allow carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis. And then they tend to close at night. If there's no photosynthesis taking place, then if they were to stay open, the benefit of being able to take in carbon dioxide, that's kind of lost. There's no photosynthesis happening, so all that would end up happening is the extra water, extra moisture would evaporate. So this closure tends to happen at nighttime. Okay, so you have a cross section of a leaf here. You might want to, I just realized I don't have a title on here, so you might want to just put a little note. This is a cross section of a leaf. Okay, so here you have the upper epidermis, which is this single layer of cells here. Okay, so that's dermal tissue. And then you have a cuticle, which is that waxy layer that you can kind of see covering. So that traps in some moisture. Okay, then you have, whoops, then you have the palisade mesophyll. So that's this single row of, they seem like vertical cells here. Okay, so these are palisades. These are the ones that are going to be where most photosynthesis takes place. And they're very tightly packed together. Okay, so crammed in so that each one of these chloroplasts that you see are able to do their own light absorption. So there's a lot there. So, a lot of light absorption can happen. And then down here is the spongy mesophyll. So you can see much more loosely packed, lots of gaps, lots of empty spaces between them. And again, that's because gas exchange is going to happen here. So there's a bit more space for air to freely circulate around these cells for that gas exchange. Now this right here is actually one of the veins of the leaf up close. So this is a vascular cylinder, and you can see the blue, that's the xylem. You might want to jot that in there. I know I don't have a label, but that's the xylem, and then that's the phloem. Okay, so that would bring water here in order to make these spongy mesophyll damp, make them moist on the outside. And then the phloem, remember, is responsible for transporting the products of photosynthesis away and off to some other part of the plant that will need that glucose, need that product. So that would be moving, substances would move in this direction to the petiole of this leaf and then onwards to somewhere else. Okay, down here, this bottom layer, that would be the lower epidermis, so that's the underside of the leaf, also single layer of dermal cells there, epidermal cells. But right here and right here, you can see those openings, so that would be a stoma or stomata, either one. But there's a stoma, and then you can see the guard cells that control it opening and shutting. Okay, so when carbon dioxide comes in, it'll go into all of these little gaps, this empty space here, and provide carbon dioxide for all these leaves that are all of these cells that are undergoing photosynthesis. Okay, and then oxygen can go out the same way too. Okay, last slide. We're going to briefly talk about transport. Now, there's a whole section in the textbook about this. Starts on page 599 if you want to go into more detail for whatever reason, but I'm going to just break it down really simply and talk about the main ways that water and nutrients are transported. We've actually talked a little bit about it so far. So, generally speaking, water is going to move through the plant almost as though it's being pulled through the plant, just like you would suck up water through a straw. Same idea. The plant is actually designed to make use of some very interesting properties that water has that allow it to actually be pulled through to the areas that need that water. Okay, so we talked about a little of this in the previous set of notes too. So remember when we talked about roots, how, and I'll use this diagram just to kind of for helping with talking, but this diagram actually ties in with how nutrients move. Anyway, so remember that we talked about how roots, um, they will use active transport to pump certain ions, certain nutrients in the soil into the root cells. Okay, so kind of bring in things like phosphorus and nitrogen and so on, actively transport that stuff into the cells of the roots. And then because there's so many more of these ions, these dissolved substances inside of the cells of the roots, it forces osmosis to take place and pull that water in. Okay, so water ends up flowing into the roots and creating this root pressure. Okay, then there's also something called capillary action, and this is a really important um, phenomenon that happens to allow water to move upwards outside, like from the roots to the rest of the plant. Okay, so capillary action takes advantage of two properties of water called cohesion and adhesion. And I realize now I didn't leave you any room to write this down, so you might want to just jot it either on the margins or something like that. So cohesion is just the property of water, how water is able to stick to other water molecules. So, cohesion, water molecules just stick to one another really easily. Okay, and we see the properties of cohesion if you've ever tried to fill a cup of water to the absolute brim, and then you add a few more drops, and you kind of see the cup of water kind of make this bulge, like the surface of the water has this bulge to it. Well, that's because the water molecules have this pull towards one another and kind of hold each other together. And so instead of spilling over, they kind of keep it together up to a certain extent, and then obviously you add more water, it'll spill over, but that's what cohesion is. Now, adhesion is how water has this ability to stick to other things. For example, in plants, the ability of water to stick to the walls of xylem, the walls of those xylem cells. Okay, so because water has these two properties, um, there's this thing that happens where water basically gets pulled. It's attracted to the walls of the tube that it's traveling through and other water molecules, and so the water actually ends up getting pulled upwards towards the leaves and towards where the water is being used, like with the rest of the plant, where photosynthesis is happening. Okay, so that's another way that transport of water is happening. The third type, well, it's kind of tied in with it, is transpiration. So remember how we talked about the water that's in these leaves, when photosynthesis happens, kind of gets evaporated away into the atmosphere. That's what transpiration is. So that actually, um, along with capillary action, along with root pressure, all of these things work together and basically have water move from the roots upwards towards the photosynthetic areas of the plant, like the leaves. Okay, so water tends to get pulled that way. Now, nutrients, however, are more like pushed throughout a plant. So, although water is pulled, nutrients kind of have this, they tend to get pushed to the areas where they're going to be stored. Okay, so generally speaking, remember nutrients like glucose, which is produced by photosynthesis. I know it says sucrose here, but glucose and sucrose are both sugars. Okay, so the source is these leaves where photosynthesis is happening. And what ends up happening is those nutrients, if they're not going to immediately be used up here, will get pushed to either go to other parts of the plant where they can be used, or in a lot of cases, pushed to storage sites where they can be kept until eventually they will be used. So, a great example would be like roots. So, for example, the starch in tubers. That's a sink. That's a storage site for nutrients. Um, if you think of fruit in plants, they're sweet for a reason. There's a lot of sucrose, a lot of sugars in those as well. They're storage sites for that, um, for all those extra nutrients. And so phloem is responsible for transporting those nutrients to those storage areas to be used at a later time. Okay, and I think that is it for notes. Okay, thanks you guys.